Since we have a lot to cover today and I want to give our incredible facilitators as much time to do what they need to do, I'm going to jump right in. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on from where in the world you are tuning in. I am Kristyn Strasburger, pronouns she, her, co-founder of the Queer Newark Oral History Project. And on behalf of the team, welcome to our fourth and final workshop of our first ever virtual oral history bootcamp. This event is made possible thanks to a grant from the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and we are encouraged to see such a strong interest over these sessions and are so glad to have you with us today. Let me begin with a few virtual housekeeping notes before talking briefly about our project and our aims. First, closed captioning is enabled. Click on the live transcript or CC button on your screen to view the subtitles or a full transcript. The session is being recorded for our archive and will be made available on our website, queer.newark.rutgers.edu, and on our YouTube channel. You have the ability to turn off your camera at any time. Please do so if you do not wish to appear in the recording. Your microphone is muted, and we ask that you keep it that way during the full session. You'll have the opportunity to unmute in the breakout sessions as you choose. We will be monitoring the chat for questions and comments, so please feel free to respectfully engage with us there. We'll also be posting some questions in the chat to capture more about who is sharing space with us today. We will be live tweeting under our account @QueerNewark using the hashtag QNBootcamp and invite you all to do the same. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the Queer Newark Oral History Project, we are a community university partnership founded in the summer of 2011 by writer, scholar, activist Darnell Moore, Rutgers Newark historian Burl Satter, and me in my other role as administrator for the Departments of History and African American and African Studies. We record interviews with LGBTQ people here in Newark and make sure that their stories are documented and made accessible to the academic and community-based researchers and any and everyone who should have that access to that history. We host programming that bridges the community and campus and believe it's central to our mission to introduce people to the kinds of methodologies we're using in our projects and to offer trainings like these to those that are interested in beginning oral history projects of their own. We hope you'll be inspired and find ways to incorporate our oral histories and that of other wonderful oral history projects in your research, educational spaces, and/or your art. At the start, I thank the New Jersey Council for the Humanities for their financial support, but must also acknowledge the support of our amazing community partners, like the Newark LGBTQ Community Center, Newark Public Library, the African American Office of Gay Concerns, Galleria Faro, and Newark Pride, for their collaboration and partnership over our 10 years in existence. We are grateful to our Rutgers Newark Chancellor's Office for providing us with our first seed grants that helped build the project from the ground. To our School of Arts and Sciences Dean's Office for financial and all different kinds of other support. Our colleagues at Dana Library for their expertise and engagement, and to our Federated Department of History colleagues for continued encouragement. Before introducing our session and our wonderful facilitators, allow me to take a minute to shout out our other Queer Newark team members without their dedication and passion for the work, because it brought us here and continues to move us forward. Our fearless co-founder, Burl Satter, tremendous co-directors, historians Whitney Strube and Timothy Stewart Winter, oral historian, database, and volunteer manager extraordinaire, Erica Fugger, our social media manager, live tweeting phenom, Dominique Rocker, and of course, our historian, at home in Newark traveling exhibit director, grant wizard, Mary Rizzo, and our longest graduate researcher, podcast developer, and soon to be PhD, Kristen Scorsone, who will be facilitating today's session. I'd be remiss without acknowledging all of the community members, interns, and volunteers who have contributed their time and energy to sustaining and growing the project over this last decade. We would not exist in the way that we do without the support of the communities that we serve. Some folks who have been interviewed by our team members registered for these sessions, and I would like to take a moment to thank you. Your stories need to be heard and preserved, and we so appreciate you trusting us to do it. As you may know, this is Transgender Awareness Week, a time to increase visibility of trans people leading up to Transgender Day of Remembrance, which occurs annually on November 20th and memorializes victims of transphobic violence. And we're intentional about scheduling the bootcamp this week because the T in LGBTQ is not silent, and we aim to record as many stories of the trans experience as possible. We remain grateful for the voices we were able to preserve in our archive, but also painfully aware that there are many we will never get to hear. We acknowledge all of the trans people whose lives were lost this year and the years before to violence while simply trying to live their truth. We remember Erica Morgan, a trans Black woman and one of our youth generation panelists in the 2011 conference, who was murdered before we had an opportunity to capture her full life's history. We invite you to listen to our interviews, especially those of our trans narrators like Erica this week. In observance of Transgender Day of Remembrance, the African American Office of Gay Concerns is hosting their highly anticipated Mascara Symposium tomorrow, Trans Power, a Call to Action, which will be held at Rutgers Newark beginning at 9:30, and the link to register will be in the chat. At 5:30, we will gather in front of the Newark YMCA at 600 Broad Street to honor the memory of Ashley Moore and the many trans lives lost this year. Registration is not required, and we hope that you will join us in solidarity. Then from 7 to 11 p.m., the opening reception of Mapping Apparitions, an amorphous art history pilot curated by artist and doctoral candidate Colleen Gutwin O'Neill, will be happening at Index Art Center. The part of her exhibition serving as an example of how oral history can be incorporated into art spaces. Now, let's meet the facilitators and two of my favorite people of today's Putting Oral History into Action. Kristyn Scorsone is a PhD candidate in American Studies here at Rutgers Newark, focusing on African American women's history, LGBTQ history, urban history, and public history. They are currently teaching African American history and are a graduate assistant for our Queer Newark Oral History Project. Building on their work with the Queer Newark Project, their research examines the labor and activism of Black, queer, and transgender women in Newark, New Jersey from 1970 to the present. Mary Rizzo is Associate Professor of History and Affiliate Faculty in the Program in American Studies and the Department of African American and African Studies at Rutgers University, Newark. She works at the intersection of inclusive public history, digital humanities, urban studies, and 20th century US cultural history. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Come and Be Shocked, Baltimore and Beyond, John Waters, and The Wire and Class Acts, Young Men and the Rise of Lifestyle. She's the founder of the Telling Untold Histories Unconference and the Chicory Revitalization Project, which uses the Black community poetry magazine Chicory to spur dialogue on place and identity. Follow it on Instagram at Chicory_Baltimore. Lots of great work there. Now, if I attempted to do justice to her body of work and the number of initiatives and public projects she's mounted, contributed to, or consulted on, we would exceed the time of the session. So let me just note that in her extremely popular courses on public history and digital humanities, she engages students in public history work on issues that include mass incarceration, immigration and detention, police misconduct in Newark, social justice movements, and LGBTQ history. I encourage all of you that are on Twitter to follow her at Rizzo_Pub History, because there's funny things and also very important attention being drawn to projects that are all around. And as we've talked about in our other sessions, we serve as resources to each other. So we want to know what you're working on, and she does such an incredible job of bringing to the fore things that we should know about. With that, let me mute and turn the floor over to our wonderful facilitators. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Christina, for that incredibly generous and lovely introduction. I'm Mary Rizzo. I'm super excited to be with you guys today, and also incredibly impressed that all of you who probably signed up for this workshop like weeks ago are actually here on a Friday afternoon. It's a lot to ask, and I am very grateful that you are all here joining us for what I think is going to be a really fantastic and interesting workshop and discussion on putting oral history into action. So let me just start by very quickly going over sort of what we are doing in this workshop today, and then we'll get into it. So our purpose and our thinking behind holding this specific session for this workshop was that the Queer Newark Oral History Project, which Kristen and I are both a part of, has experimented with several different kinds of publicly facing projects that bring the oral histories that we collect with LGBTQ narrators to life for the public. And these range from traveling exhibits to walking tours to podcasts and other things that are already in existence and are on the horizon. And in our researching and thinking about oral history, we found that there's a lot of attention paid by oral historians to the process of collecting interviews, to training people to collect interviews. And that's super important. That's a critical work, right? That we also help train people to do interviews. But we felt like there was less attention paid to what happens to those interviews when they're collected. And on one hand, the collecting of interviews themselves is an important work right there, right? You are collecting and creating an archive of knowledge that can be accessed in the future and is really important for adding to our understanding of the communities that we are working in. But the reality is that a lot of oral histories are very inaccessible to members of the general public when they are simply lengthy interviews on a website. So we really wanted to talk through and think through with you all what are the sort of issues that are raised when you try to take life history interviews and turn them into publicly facing projects. So we'll be talking about the challenges and the benefits that come along with that. So our other goal for this is for all of us to be resources for each other. So Kristen and I are co-leading this session, and we have some experience, of course, in this area, but I'm guessing that all of you, because you're here, also have a lot of experience and expertise as well. And so we really would love to use this to create a space where we can be resources for each other. So please feel free to communicate in the chat ideas or comments or suggestions or resources that you have, and we have set aside time for discussion and question and answer throughout. So the structure of our session today, we are going to start by Kristen and I will both discuss some case studies of projects that we have worked on using Queer Newark interviews that are publicly facing. So after we talk about those projects, those case studies, we will then have some time for Q&A. And then following that, because this is a workshop, we wanted to actually do something with you guys and to sort of put some of our ideas into practice. So in the second part of the workshop, we will be asking you to take a look at some recent Queer Newark social media posts, which are taking excerpts from interviews and interpreting them for social media purposes, and think about what we've done, what else you could do with those posts and interviews, and other ways that you could interpret them. And we'll do that in groups. And then we will have a little time for wrap up and question and answer at the end. So hopefully that sounds great to you guys. So I'm going to keep talking for a little while. So I'll just share my screen and okay, can you guys see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk first about a project that Queer Newark did called At Home in Newark, Stories from the Queer Newark Oral History Project, which was a traveling exhibit that premiered in 2017 and then traveled to several different locations until the pandemic basically stopped that. But it will be available to travel again. So if you are interested in learning more about how this traveling exhibit could come to your space or location, please do reach out. We would love to talk to you about that. So this exhibit At Home in Newark was a collaborative process, right? So we created this exhibit using the Queer Newark oral history interviews in a collaboration between students at Rutgers University Newark in a class taught by me, and a graphic design class taught by Chantal Fitchsang as part of the Visual Means collective on our campus. So that's that picture over the left are sort of all the student creators. Our community collaborators, however, were the members of the Newark LGBTQ Community Center. And that was really critical. And I will spend some time talking about why we saw that community collaboration as so important. So they were our community advisory board. And the exhibit was on display first at the Newark Public Library. So this slide gives you just a little sense of what the exhibit looked like. So you can see it hanging in the middle picture there, and a little snippet of it on the right with some of our narrators in that picture as well. The picture up on the top right gives you an idea of this really cool design that our graphic design people created for us and came up with these beautiful colored vinyl banners that would lead people from the front entrance of the library to where the exhibit is. But even more interesting, those rectangles that you see on the floor are actually quotes from the Queer Newark interviews. And there are some quotes on the wall as well. These were done on vinyl stickers. So basically they did no damage and you could just like peel them off after the exhibit was done. It was really, really cool. And, in the interest of time, I won't get into a lot of detail about what all this cost. Because that's obviously important. But if you have questions about that, I am happy to talk about cost and how we made this happen in a very short amount of time for a very small amount of money. So let me just show you a little bit more about what the exhibit focused on. So our goal with the exhibit was to take this wealth of information in the Queer Newark interviews and turn it into a traveling exhibit that was a more accessible presentation of information about the history and sort of contemporary issues going on in the LGBT community in Newark specifically. We ended up focusing the issue around the idea of home, which is why we called it At Home in Newark. And our concept, or what Beverly Sorrell calls our big idea, was that LGBTQ Newarkers have actively created Newark as a home for generations. And it was important for us to have that historical perspective because in a lot of ways, there is very little or had been very little material that discussed or recorded the existence of the LGBTQ community in Newark before the Queer Newark Project was born 10 years ago. So we really wanted to make a claim that queer people have been in Newark for a long time and are in Newark today, and that this city is also their home, although it's not always been a welcoming home. And I think we did not shy away from addressing issues that were really difficult and complicated as well. So why did we do an exhibit? Well, we felt like an exhibit was a great way for us to get greater visibility for the Queer Newark Project, but really for the LGBTQ Community Center as well. They're a nonprofit organization, our longtime community partner. So we wanted to help raise their visibility. And because they're a longtime community partner, that allowed this process to move fairly quickly. You may be in a situation where you do not have a community partner, a longtime community partner like that. And again, that's something we can talk about and give you some sort of ideas about how you can develop relationships of trust, which are critical for doing this kind of work. And again, as I've said, our goal was to make the oral histories accessible and usable. Right. And the traveling exhibit was a key part of that because it could travel around and has. So in addition to being at the Newark Public Library Central Branch, it's also been at NJIT, at audible.com headquarters for their Pride Month. And the one that sort of makes my heart warm is it was on display at Newark Beth Israel Hospital. And the hospital brought the exhibit there because they wanted to use it to help staff become more culturally competent around LGBTQ issues. So that was really a powerful, I think, a use of the exhibit. So I want to talk about, so some of the issues that I want to talk about are around issues of sharing authority, the ethics of positionality, and how do we interpret life history interviews. But first, I want to start with my really beautiful, complicated diagram here. You can tell I'm not a graphic designer because of the way this slide looks. But this is the way that I approach doing community-based exhibitions or really any kind of community-based public history project, right? So that purple square in the middle is the project, right? The end result. What is the product that you are trying to do? And I think it's really critical that you figure out a project and that is going to speak to an issue of contemporary importance that is meaningful to a community, right? And I'm a historian, so to me, the historical lens is really important piece of that. I don't think it's difficult to make that happen. I think that most of the contemporary issues that communities are dealing with today have historical roots. So I think it's a matter of sort of figuring out how to address them rather than whether there is a connection to be made. But you don't get to that purple square in the middle without, I think, the other two items on the sides, right? So first off, you have to ground your public history project in excellent historical research and analysis. Sometimes that means archival research, but of course for this exhibit, it was primarily research using the oral history interviews collected by Queer Newark. Although we also did archival research, we also did a lot of reading in the scholarly literature on Newark history and LGBTQ studies. But you have to base your historical knowledge somewhere. The other piece is also critical, and that's the community collaboration piece. If you want your public project to connect with an audience in the community, then that community needs to be part of the process of creating that project to ensure that it is meaningful to them. I mean, on some level, it's so clear and obvious how important that is. And at the same time, I think it's not necessarily done as much as it should be. So bringing those community collaborators in helps to make sure that your work is going to be speaking to, in meaningful ways, a particular audience and community. And this suggests that it's like these 2 arrows point at the middle. Really what it should be is like a big circular arrow, because it's an iterative process, right? So it's not like you finish the historical research and then you bring the community in. You are doing all of the things at once, right? So it's a feedback loop between the history and the community to create the project. And I'll get back to that in a little bit more in a minute. So I wanted to raise a couple of issues that I think came up as we were doing this exhibit project that are sometimes difficult to deal with. And I think it's important that we address difficult issues when we're talking among ourselves as professionals here too, right? So one of the things that I've worked in public history for a really long time. And one of the concerns that I've heard from public historians when they want to do public projects on marginalized communities that they are not a part of is that they are concerned about their own positionality and that they should not be doing this work. And I think that comes from a good place, right? I think that that's thoughtful. And I think, it's important to stop and think, like, am I the right person to do this job? I think that's appropriate. But I don't think you should end there. I don't think it should be like, well, I'm not in that community, so I can't do that work. Because I think that's a dead end, frankly, for all of us, right? Because the reality is no one is a member of all communities, right? So there is no one LGBTQ community, for example, right? We understand that the idea of intersectionality is that people's identities are shaped by multiple factors. So that's race, gender, class, religion, disability, ability, sexuality, etc. So no one's experience can represent an entire community because that community is not one thing. So even when we talk about the LGBTQ community, that's a flattening term. And we really worked hard in the exhibit to try to breathe life into that. But it's important to make sure that, we are not flattening out people's differences. And I think this question around positionality is something I think about a lot. Particularly, I do work in African American history, and I'm a white woman, and I understand that that can be complicated. So what I often tell people is that experience is not expertise. So their experience is a kind of knowledge, right? You live in a certain body in a certain time and in a certain place, and you learn things about the world from that, and that is absolutely valid knowledge. Expertise is a different kind of knowledge. It's the kind of knowledge you get from being a scholar and doing research. That is also a valid kind of knowledge. So that by bringing those two kinds of knowledge together through the process that I just outlined, I think that we can get to a place where we can share authority appropriately and ethically, so that we are creating public history projects that don't always have to be about us necessarily, but are rooted in community. I'll give you one quick example that came up during our process here. So we had a listening session with the LGBTQ Community Center early on in our exhibit process. And one of the issues that folks brought up there that they were very interested in us talking about in the exhibit was mental health. So they felt that mental health was a really key issue affecting the LGBTQ community in Newark, among other things. And so when we got back to our class the next week, we discussed that and whether that was an issue we wanted to tackle. And in the end, we decided it wasn't an issue that we could address, because we felt like none of us in that room were trained in therapy or psychiatry or psychology. None of us had real expertise in the history of any of those fields. And there's a long-standing stereotype rooted in homophobic medical ideas that queer people are mentally ill. And we were very concerned that in the space of the exhibit, where we could only talk about this issue in a very short span of time with only a few words, that it would be inappropriate and unethical for us to raise that issue without being able to do it justice. So we didn't feel like we had the expertise and authority to deal with that. And so we decided that it was better for us not to talk about that issue. And because we had this process where the community was constantly giving us feedback, we could explain that to them and get feedback from them and make sure that they were on the same page with us. And it ended up being totally okay because we addressed so many other issues in this exhibit. So another thing that I want to just mention is this, I think, the ethical questions that come up when we are interpreting oral history interviews. Every oral history interview in the Queer Newark archive is a life history interview, basically. I think on average, they're like 2 hours long, but like the longest one is 6 hours, right? These are incredible sources of information, but it also means that you have the responsibility of thinking about how do you interpret someone's whole life and narrow it down to a quote that you can put in an exhibit. Right? That is a deeply ethical question, and I think it's important that we really think about that when we're engaged in this process. So I want to give a couple of thoughts on that. So the first thing is to refuse to do thesis-driven research, right? So if you go into your project knowing what you want it to say, and then you only find the kind of quotes and things that support what it is you already wanted to say, that's what we would call thesis-driven research. And it's really not a good scholarly practice. Instead, this diagram, this mind map that you see on the slide, is how we went out about approaching our project. All of my students read through and listened to the Queer Newark interviews and then pulled out, coded themes in the interviews. And then we created this mind map and then thought about how do they fit together. So you can see things like there was a lot of information about safe spaces and policing, about gentrification, about housing and homelessness, right? Those were in the interviews themselves. And then we thought, okay, on an abstraction level, we can call that home. These are people who are talking about home in all of these different ways. So we really let the interviews lead us to our themes. Secondly, I think we need to think about the ethics of that interpretation process and to just simply be empathetic. None of us, I'm going to say this, a generalization, none of us would want our whole life to be represented by one quote, right? Or one moment that we experienced or one thing that we did. So when you are interpreting someone's life history interview, think in those terms as well. Does this quote that you're pulling out from the interview, does it represent what this person actually believes and who they are? Is it something that they would agree with? And again, this is where the community collaboration and feedback process is absolutely critical. All right, so the last thing I want to say, and then I will stop because I'm going over my time, is that in my experience, a lot of public historians are again, concerned about touching these difficult issues because they feel like they're too complex for the public to get into. And I think it's exactly the opposite. I think the public is all about complexity, and someone can look at an exhibit and understand that no issue has one right answer or not. So for example, we touched on in the exhibit the issue of gentrification, which Kristen Scorsone has written brilliantly about gentrification in Newark and its effect on Black lesbian entrepreneurs in particular, like Peggy Miller, who is pictured on this slide. So gentrification for Peggy Miller is something that has given her more opportunity, or their business more opportunity. So they see that investment as a positive. On the other hand, Angie Rains, whose quote is on the left side, has a very different view, a much more skeptical view of gentrification as a Black transgender woman. So we put both of these quotes and these images on the exhibit because we didn't feel like it was our place to make a final determination. What does the LGBTQ community think about gentrification in Newark? I don't know. There's not one answer to that. So we felt like that complexity, we could represent that complexity, and then that spurs conversation for our viewers. So I'm going to end there and turn it over to Kristen.
Hi all, thanks Mary. Mary was actually my professor. I was in her exhibit class and really lucky to have had her as a professor. As you can tell, she's brilliant. So I'm going to be talking about, excuse me, I'm going to be talking about the walking tour that Queer Newark created, and I had a hand in helping do that, and our podcast. So let me just share my screen as well so you can have a bit of a PowerPoint. Can you all see? Cool. All right. Okay, so again, my name is Kristen, so they, them pronouns, and I have been working with the Queer Newark Oral History Project at Rutgers since 2015. And just to tell you a little bit about myself, like I'm queer and non-binary. I grew up in the town neighboring to Newark and in Kearney, and I didn't know my queer history. I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, and I especially didn't know it in terms of local queer history and trans history. So I figured I'd have to go to the city, like New York City, like everybody thinks of, Greenwich Village, or look to the media, like, see, just be waiting for Roseanne to kiss that lady or Ellen to admit she's gay, little did I know that there's all this amazing LGBTQ history and community, like right in my own backyard, right? So this is why this is my passion project, and I'm so proud to work on Queer Newark with these folks. So, being a member of Queer Newark, I've been lucky to have done about 20-25 oral history so far, and being able to help design public history projects for Queer Newark. So myself and other graduate students, and you'll see them in that photo there, we work together to design and lead Queer Newark oral history walking tours. And so, like Mary talked about just a minute ago, like, with the exhibit, we wanted to also like take this like wealth of information in the oral histories, but in this instance, turn them into a walking tour. And as, basically as we worked together to create it, we had to consider what was our big idea and our major themes, and how we're going to interpret these places on the tour. The major questions we were grappling with were, what is visible? What will folks actually see when we walk around? And what is walkable? Newark's a very big city. Will the walk be too physically strenuous? In an urban environment, how do we keep folks safe, especially as we cross busy streets? We needed to have a plan for the weather too. And we've learned to keep ponchos on hand for unexpected rain. Thank you, Christina Strasburger, for always doing that. And extra bottles of water too, especially because it's always, we do a lot of these tours around Pride Month, which in Newark is always in July. It's always super hot. My wife always jokes that as queer folks, as a culture, we should get together and change the whole celebration to October when it's cooler out. But that's neither here nor there. So, how do we show the community? What are the spots we're going to talk about? What are we going to show people? And then it became like, okay, as we're trying to like map this out, we started realizing like, unfortunately, this is, realizing something we've always known but never thought about in the physical sense. This is an absent history. This is a history that is hard to find. So how do we make what's physically absent present? So much of LGBTQ history is lost to time, in general, in books, in archives, in the media, in our day-to-day lives. What happens, when the places we take folks to are no longer there? So as we went through some of the major flashpoints and important spaces in Newark's LGBTQ plus history, again, like we're like, okay, this is a tour of absence. And most of these spaces are gone. So does that mean we give up? Or really, maybe that's the point. Absence became our big idea. So in other words, it became our main point. And so this is us, sort of logistically, we're on the tour together. Here's all, we've been fortunate to have a lot of folks come with us. And again, like thinking about logistics, and we'll come back to absence in a second, but just like, you're walking in these urban streets and it's noisy, it's loud. There's a lot of loud traffic, buses and trucks. And if you can almost kind of see me on the left in next to the person with the white t-shirt, like we have bullhorns. And I highly recommend getting bullhorns because yes, it's awkward. Nobody wants to hold a bullhorn and talk into it, but you just got to own it. And it is much more helpful. And we also make sure to duck into side streets and give folks time to get together too. Like as you're walking along, people, not everybody walks at the same pace, and you need to be mindful of that. And along these lines, when we have long stretches of time, if this happens to you as well, if you're doing a walking tour and you have to walk pretty far from one spot to the other, give a little historical tidbits along the way. We do that about LGBTQ history, but we also just do it about Newark's urban history. If we know like there's an interesting building or something we can point out. But so, we get to our first stop, and our very first stop is Absence. It's the spot where Murphy's Tavern, which is a community bar that was very beloved. It shows up frequently in our oral histories. Folks always talk about Newark with like a very deep fondness as a safe space. And Murphy's not only was a safe space, it also had a really huge moment in Newark's LGBTQ plus history, because Murphy joined with 2 other New Jersey bars to fight back against state surveillance and the Alcohol and Beverage Commission, which was trying to shut it down. They were trying to close down these bars because they considered homosexuals to be a public nuisance. So these bars said, no, we're not going to take this. And they actually fought back. They took the ABC all the way to the New Jersey Supreme Court and actually won. This is a landmark victory. And this happened in 1967. So this was 2 years prior to Stonewall uprising. And just like part of those like incremental victories that started to lead up to bigger pushes for equality. And I think it's important to tell folks this history and emphasize how important it is to our local queer history. And yet we bring people there and there's nothing in the space to acknowledge it. No historical marker, nothing in the history books either. And thus it's sort of effectively erased, right? But our project and these tours become a critical way to tell and acknowledge what is untold and unseen. And the tours make this acknowledgement communal. It's happening in real time. And Murphy's also gives us the opportunity to do some interpretive work on the queer bars and clubs as sanctuary spaces for queer folks, and to resist, as Mary just pointed out, like a flattening of the LGBTQ community. Not all of the spaces like Murphy's were uniformly safe or beloved. Murphy's, in fact, was, to some of our trans women narrators, trans exclusionary. They were not allowed there. And if one narrator spoke about, she was sort of allowed in, but she had to like come in through the back door and sit, on the side and be quiet. So, and then there's another a narrator who talks about going to a predominantly white neighborhood to hang out in a bar there, and being him and his boyfriend, they're an interracial couple. They were shot at as they left because that bar was located in a neighborhood hostile to Black Newarkers and I'm sure to queer people as well, because this was in the 70s. So yeah, so this is a chance to sort of give this sort of nuance. And in order to sort of like help facilitate bringing these stories to life a little bit more, if there's no building there, we also pass around laminated photos for folks to look at. For a second, I'll just point out that the person on the left is Sakia Gunn, who was sadly killed in a hate crime. She was a very young person. When we reach the spot where she was murdered, we always pause to have a moment of silence. And I think this is really important to do and acknowledge and not just gloss over for sort of a celebratory or progressive narrative of LGBTQ plus history, even whether it's broadly or in the city of Newark. And and also often community members join us. Sometimes people, they knew and loved Sakia, and it's important for them to have a moment to honor her. And it's also important for us to welcome their stories. So as we're walking around, community members will often sort of just like start telling their own stories. They'll be like, oh, I saw, this movie here, and I did this, and I hung out in this park, and I went to a rave over here, and it's just so awesome to be playing, like, and if we had thrown our hands up during the planning and said, well, this is a story of absences, and therefore there's no point to doing it, we would have missed out on this other active storytelling that happens in the moment, where someone who is of the community can tell their firsthand history right then and there. And it has happened on virtually every single tour we've done so far. So it's not a rare occurrence. And we love it because, our project is a community collaboration. When we finish our tour, we end in community as it exists now, or exists in this moment of ending. And so in the beginning, when we first started doing the tours, we would end at Newark LGBTQ Community Center. So folks could go in and experience it, and they would be having like game night, and people would go and play games after the tour. And then we'd also walk past and point out queer-owned businesses as we got to the last stop. And when it's a tour during Newark Pride, we stop near the festivities so folks can walk over with us to the annual festival. And, and this would also serve to raise visibility for our community partners like the Newark LGBTQ Community Center and Newark Pride, and also Newark Public Library, which is now where the Newark LGBTQ Center lives. And we have a virtual walking tour that a grad student, Mi-Hun Yoon, created for those that are too far to join us on these walks. And so I also, wanted to create a podcast. I wanted to do this because I wanted to share these stories to the wider public, who may not be in Newark, and by sharing in a way that would be shorter than someone having to listen to a full-length interview on our website. And not everybody was going to sit down and go on our website and listen to like a 2-hour or 6-hour interview. So, researchers and students maybe, but probably not most people. So I wanted to make sure it was on iTunes for folks beyond Newark to find, and also put it on our website for those that don't have iTunes, or maybe, don't use that platform, or of limited, accessibility. So I also wanted to use the podcast as an opportunity to interview folks and see what they are up to now. The oral history, exists as this sort of like life up to this point, and then what happens after. Sometimes folks are still doing very interesting things or work, and they want to share, and I want to provide that for the community to do so. So to that end, I recorded community interviews. I recorded episodes on oral history as a historical method for folks in the field. An episode on queer Newark, Newark's LGBTQ history broadly. But like I have, like I said, interviews with community members like Sharonda Wheeler, who has the sunglasses on. She's the president of Newark Pride. So I was able to talk to her about what it's like to do the work of putting Pride together every year, and how, folks could do this in their own areas. So sort of like sharing that knowledge that she has. And I also did an interview with my friend, Alish, who's wearing the jeans in that other photo there, after our friend Ray Rivas passed away, who's playing the guitar. So again, I just want to underline how important this work is, and how absences and ways to fill in those gaps and silences weave throughout all of our oral history projects. I was actually supposed to record Ray's oral history for the project, and he unexpectedly passed away the day before we were going to meet. Ray was not just a friend of mine, but someone I considered to be like literally a trans revolutionary. He was unapologetically trans all his life, he, him pronouns. He was the only out person in our high school. He looked like that in high school in the 90s. And he never let other people define him or change him, even though he was often discriminated against and bullied, and even experienced intense, really bad street violence because of his identity in Newark and in Kearney. Losing Ray right before I could meet with him was such a stark, unfortunate and stark reminder of how our history can be lost like overnight in a moment, not just with the older generation, but folks around us. So I decided not to let that happen. I invited his best friend, Alish, to talk about Ray and who he was and why his life is important to our history. And I'm really proud that I got to provide that platform for Alish, who told me that he found it really healing to get to share his best friend's story as a part of history and a part of the archive. So with that, I just want to end by saying that writing this presentation made me think about one of our oral histories with Darrell Rochester, who is also sadly gone from us. And he passed away actually almost a year to today. It was in early December. And he was an amazing hairstylist and cosmetologist and a pivotal contributor to Newark's club scene. And I was thinking about this story he shared in his oral history of all this glitter falling off queer and trans bodies as they walk to and from this club Zanzibar in Newark. And so they're all sweaty. They've been like dancing. They got all this glitter. They were hanging out with queer family and friends, right? Having fun. And he points out that like, just, you know, you all know this, just when you think glitter is gone, it shows up again and again. It's in your clothes, even though you wash them. It's in your hair. It's in your carpets, on your pillow. It has this sort of like impermanent permanence, right? And so this made me think about this queer theorist, Jose Esteban Munoz, who once wrote that queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. And Newark's queer bars and clubs and businesses and other institutions, they may at times vanish, but the capacity for queer world making will continue. And we as public historians are part of that queer world making for others through continuously finding ways to bring these stories to life for others. So really it's not absent, it's glitter, it's tiny, but it's there. And the point is to keep finding it, and it leaves fabulous traces. And so, yes, you all may not be here to do queer history, but the stories you're going to bring to life may not be that easily uncovered either. And oral history can provide that foundation of narrative to fuel other forms of storytelling. And that is the point. And I hope you all enjoyed that. Thank you.
All right, awesome. I love the glitter. So we have some time for any questions that folks might want to ask at this point. So, you know, you can drop in the chat, but I also think you're able to unmute yourself and just ask a question if you feel so moved. Open up that space for questions if there are any. And if not, that's cool too.
Is anybody any public history projects similar to these?
So I was also in a class with Mary where we did a public history like presentation that was really cool. Ours was specifically digital projects. So my group built a website and it was also using the Queer Newark archives. So we built a website for some of our trans narrators and highlighting the different aspects of their lives. And it was very important to like think through the kinds of things that we wanted to talk about and how we were going to put them, and also how you're specifically going to do it based on your project, right? Like you were talking about the walking tour and how that might function. That's going to be very different than the digital website that we built up. But I think that they're both very different, but very like engaging ways that we can bring oral histories to life.
And I just want to say, I got back this with people like students who have been in my classes, I promise. But no, Dominique is making a hugely important point, is that format is really critical in thinking about what the stories are that you're telling and how, you know, so what is your end format that shapes so much of what it is that you can do with the material that the historical material and the interview material that you're doing.
We have a question in the chat. Someone's asked, does it require new or additional consent to take the interview and put it into a podcast, for example? I mean, no, for us, like Queer Newark has a really, we already have a consent process, which when they give their oral history to us, we have them sign. And I want to, and just to like sort of emphasize consent too for a moment, is that we have this consent that tells people, it's a form, and it tells people, you know, how their oral history will be used and where it will live and how who will be looking at it for the most part. And so folks have complete control over that. And then when they give their story and before they even give their interview, we always let them know, you know, if you say anything that you regret, or like maybe, you know, we're talking about queer history, so they might out somebody accidentally or tell a story they don't no longer want out there. We allow them to check out their interview and transcript before it goes on our website and say whether or not they want us to redact anything. And we happily do so. And even going forward, you know, after they have that opportunity, if later on they decide, oh, please remove something, we're going to do it for them. They have complete control over their stories. But we don't have them sign any new consent form after that.
I would say though that if you're about to start an oral history project, and you think you might want to do things like podcasts, etc., just make sure you word your consent form so that it allows for uses beyond just the sort of archival that you may be doing.
If there are no other questions, and please feel free to like add questions in the chat as you think of them. We're going to move forward to doing an activity together. So in breakout rooms, we're going to have you, what you're going to do is look at Queer Newark social media posts. So, these posts all have been, thanks to Dominique, our social media wizard. She's been posting all week long for trans awareness. And so all of these social media posts, they live on our Instagram and our Twitter and our Facebook. You'll see them. They're all sort of the same similar format in that it's a picture of the narrator and a quote and some context. So, we're going to provide all of the handles and questions in the chat in a moment. But so basically, in a world where we're not in a Zoom room, you would, look over the entire oral histories and study the transcripts. But for the sake of this exercise, instead of having you listen to clips, we're going to use these social media posts instead, because they still give us like a sense of the folks and their actual words. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you about 5 to 7 minutes just to go poke around on our social media accounts and scroll through these recent posts. Pick a couple of examples that you want to discuss with your group. You're going to be in a group of a few people. It'll be more than just you and someone else, but it'll be like 4 or 5 people. And we're going to provide you with those questions, which they are in the chat now, to think about while you're in your groups. And when you come back from the breakout rooms, we would love to hear from you on what you discussed and what you came up with. So the questions that we want you to think about are, how would you use these quotes to create a public history project? Because they're brief quotes, you're going to have to try to imagine the bigger context of their stories. But how would you put these voices together in conversation with each other? What else might these stories tell us about, aside from the personal experience of gender and sexuality? What themes or topics could you pull out of these quotes? And do these quotes work for the project your group envisions? If not, what would you do differently? So we'll give you a few minutes to look that over, and then we'll place you in breakout rooms shortly. If anybody wants to share feedback, I could speak for our group, but if either of you wanted to talk, it's fine. I can be quiet. But so we just when talking about the different social media posts, I think the biggest things that came up were, wanting more background on the people, who are they, just more information on them. And this sort of morphed into us, talking about our own work. Linda does a lot of work on oral history in Charlotte, and Jennifer is a teacher for college, teaches LGBTQ social change in Jersey City. And so she's teaching oral history. And so we're just talking about projects they've seen, and Linda shared that sometimes with exhibits, certain groups are always front and center, say, white cisgender men, versus she would love to see more exhibits on women, especially older women. And that's another way that even not just queer history, but a lot of history can get flattened in that way. And it would be nice to think also more intergenerationally, and thinking about how Jennifer mentioned, her students being, a lot of them are younger folks, they word their questions differently even, than other narrators would. And so it provokes interesting answers, but it also can be tough when they don't know certain historical context because they're just young, you know what I mean? So, it's just making sure to always research the history in the area that you're going to create a project on. So for me, knowing not just LGBTQ history in Newark, but knowing the broader Newark history so that I can tell the story most effectively. And also when doing the oral histories, to get the sort of the foundation of what this project will eventually be, in other forms, being able to ask the right questions to bring forth like their experiences of things like, you know, say like the Newark uprising or 9/11, you know, and also thinking about place. We talked a lot about like thinking about place in general, and not just around that history, but also like, you know, what is happening here, what is happening here right now, and like how is it in relation to other areas. So like for us, for me and Jennifer, Jersey City and Newark are often overshadowed by New York City. Whereas for Linda and Charlotte, they're sort of the big dog, you know, but they also want to be mindful of, you know, certain areas in their state is like conservative and certain areas are more liberal. And like, how does that work in mostly a lot of rural areas in that state, and how to bring forth that history. And even if you don't agree politically, let's say, with the folks that you're talking about, like how Mary pointed out with the narrators that have different views on gentrification, to be able to still accurately tell those stories, because this is those people's real lives and the way they feel. So yeah, that's what it came up for us. And then pierogies.
So does anyone else from another group want to share, or if you have any questions too, we've got a few minutes.
So one of the things that we were talking about is the process of like choosing quotes and what quotes you choose for some kind of public facing, whether it be social media or, so I'm doing an oral history project right now for my dissertation. And which quotes do I choose, knowing that most people who read my dissertation are never going to go seek out the full interviews, you know, and with the dissertation, I have more room to paraphrase and to give more information in my footnotes and stuff like that, but still the process of choosing and the process of what gets left out when you have to make those choices. And that was one of the things that we were talking about a lot. And I think I don't think there's like an answer for it. I think it's just a complicated process that's very much ongoing.
Yeah, I think that is such a huge issue. And so, you know, you're right. There's absolutely, of course, no one answer for that. I do think that what's useful or what's been really great for Queer Newark stuff is that because all of our interviews are available on our website, we can at least point people to that. So it's like, this is like just one quote from this very lengthy interview. But if you want to get the whole thing, here it is. Now, how many people go do that? You know, very small number, but at least we give them access to it. So we're not taking complete control. Like, it's not like this is our material and you can't ever see it. So, you know, I think that that's something for people to think about.
Well, to respond to Mary's point, one thing we do I'm a historian and curator at LaGuardia Community College at LaGuardia Wagner Archives in Long Island City, Queens. It's a CUNY school. I've done several LGBTQ exhibits in the last few years, based in oral history and photography. We actually, in our social media, we edit the interviews. They're always filmed. And then we include excerpts. So rather than going with a dynamic quote that really hits hard, we'll pick maybe a 60 or 75-second clip and then tweet that. So it could be, you know, a whole range of topics: family support or lack thereof, coming out, or, you know, finding community through art, through political activism. So I'm just suggesting that as a possible alternative, because just isolating a particular quote, yeah, they're interesting, they're provocative, they could spark an idea for an exhibit, and that's what we were talking about in the group with respect to family. Some of the quotes. But maybe giving a little bit more could, you know, and you get a greater sense, not too long, maybe 45, 60, 75 seconds of that oral history interview that you've done. And yeah, that's a possibility as well, I think.
That's a really great point. I just want to say one thing about that. We actually have been asked to participate in a couple of different ways. So we had a pop-up exhibit as part of the Mascara conference where we did have clips of interviews. It wasn't as short. I love what you shared with having that 45 to 60 seconds, because my attention span is also about that long by the time I get out of work. So, I mean, I really love that. So, and I did put, if you wouldn't mind sharing, we'd love to follow back, check out how you frame things, because as we said at the start, we really feel like we're a resource for each other. But also, as part of African American AIDS Day, we took excerpts from Miss Pucci's transcripts and from different things and snipped them together to try to form a larger project too. So what you say is really a lot of power in making sure that their voices can be heard a lot better than also trying to make it into a graphic. But we do, the best we can with the medium that we share. But it sounds really wonderful how you're incorporating the work. So I just wanted to say thanks for that.
That just made me think as well about how wonderfully clips can work, and they would have to be a little bit longer, but if they are telling a story rather than being, like a statement, it just can illustrate so much. And it might need to be 4 minutes long, but it's something that someone's willing to listen to because you're following that. Now, not all interviewees can tell stories well, but some people are just natural storytellers, and they just, that nugget there will illustrate so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what you all are saying is making me think too about something that is really important, which is that when you are doing this kind of work for the public, you also have to think about not just the ethics, the sort of ethical considerations around your narrators, but also then how do you appeal to the public? And so, like what you were just saying, Tina, like not everybody is a great storyteller. But if you do have that person who is, or you do have that quote or excerpt from an interview that is just really beautifully worded or has a lot of emotion behind it, then that's captivating to the public who is listening to it. So it's not just like intellectual, right? Like there's also something about the emotional sort of aspect that we have to tap into as well.
This is Becky. Sorry, I'm not on camera. My internet connection is not so great. But I just wanted to jump in because something you just said, Mary, reminded me of another piece. I was in the same group with Ariel, but another piece that we talked about was with social media specifically, how, of course, there's a character limit like with Twitter where there's not with Facebook, and how that would affect the posts. But so something like that, but talking about how there's those kind of specific considerations around social media, and how in some ways that's sort of similar to some of what Kristen was talking about.
The Newark Oral History Project was founded in the summer of 2011 by activist and writer Darnell Moore.
I recognize that sound.
Sorry, I had opened the link and then it started in the background and then I couldn't find the tab. I'm so sorry. So I was just trying to say that that it just reminded me of what Kristen was saying with having, with the walking tour, having to think about things like the weather. So it's like on the one hand, you have the substance, you have the actual content of these interviews that you are repurposing and resharing in these different forms and formats. But then you also have these like environmental factors of, that come into play with those other formats that aren't actually about, the substance. So with a walking tour, it might be the weather, or the street is really loud or something like that. And with social media, it might be there's a character limit, or, the way the different algorithms work and needing to sort of game that process a little bit. So anyway, sorry for all of my technical issues, but I thought that was an interesting kind of thread that we kind of picked up on these environmental pieces.
Yeah, totally. It's like always interesting because you can't control the weather, you can't control the noise, and sometimes you don't solve for everything, and then you realize it's like trial and error. And I think that's okay. Again, it's not about giving up. It's just you just keep doing what you can. I mean, we actually had community were upset when we didn't have a walking tour once because the weather was so bad. And I guess they just like really wanted to go anyway, which is a kind of a compliment to us, I think. But also can't put people's safety at risk to tell them this history too. So yeah, there's always stuff that's going to come up, and that's okay. You just keep going and figuring it out and solving it. And then it helps for the next project, even if it's a different format, to know how to think through all of these things together.
So I know go ahead, Kristen. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I was just going to say,
Tina, sorry.
It's about the walking tour and everything. I wish we could do a walking tour in Charlotte, but we really can't because it's just so scattered. So the only option that we really have is a driving tour, which is not as nice really, in that you're in a cocoon and, and also you have to have the person who can handle, well, both of those events as well. And we did have someone in Charlotte who was absolutely brilliant at that. And he's done some Zoom tours for us, for the community. But anyway, so it's a special person who can do a really good walking tour. You have to be an actor.
Yeah. One thing I'll say, I have been on a tour that was in a like not a full bus, but like a half. Is an environmental tour of Newark for the Ironbound Community Corporation, and that was really great because they had the same issue where it's just so much to kind of get through because they take you through so many different spaces in Newark that have obviously like just a ton of environmental issues because it's a burdened community. But yeah, and I felt like it was really effective. I enjoyed it, even though it wasn't walking around. But I think obviously it's probably a lot more money to have to do it that way, which is tough to get around too. Also, I want to say before we leave, Linda shared with me a really great, while we're sharing different resources, she shared the Invisible Histories Project in Alabama, which is like, it's interesting because it's a cross repository of different states and their LGBTQ history. And just to sort of make like a one big giant archive of what's happening in different areas in the South.
I'm actually adding these to, we're going to give you a link to a resource document. So I've added the project that Stephen mentioned and the Invisible Histories project to this document. And it's a Google Doc. So, you guys could add, maybe not, sorry, we could set it so you could add to it. But yes, thank you, Christina, for sharing that link. Kristen, did you want to say anything else before we wrap up?
No, just thank you. I've been into all the sessions and I see some of you have been at a few of them, and thank you for coming to the boot camp in totality and for coming to any of the sessions that you've been able to, especially to ours. And it's been really nice to meet you all. And I'm glad to have gotten to talk to some of you too in the breakout rooms and everything. So thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to reiterate that. Thank you all so much. We are really just honored that you spent this amount of time with us on a Friday afternoon on the week before Thanksgiving. So I hope that we do hear from you again. You stay in touch on our social media or via email or however. And, maybe we'll see you all in the future at events on Zoom or hopefully better in person. So thank you all for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
And thank you, Christina, who is
of course,
project.
Oh my God. Christina, forever.